I'm Walter Hensley, 68 years old, and I built a chain of 7 hardware and lumber stores from a single rented garage in 1979. 6 weeks ago, on the anniversary of my late wife Carol's passing, I called my daughter Brianne to ask if she'd come sit with me for an hour at the cemetery like she had every year since the funeral. She told me she had a work emergency and couldn't possibly get away. That evening, I drove to the cemetery alone, and on my way home I passed by her husband's restaurant, the one I'd quietly loaned them $90,000 to open, and through the window I saw her laughing with her husband and his mother over a bottle of champagne, celebrating something that had nothing to do with grief. I didn't go inside. I didn't make a scene. I went home, opened my old filing cabinet, and started pulling threads that would eventually unravel a plot to have me declared mentally unfit and locked out of the company I'd spent 40 years building with my own 2 hands. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from tonight, neighbor. And if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, hit that like button so they know they're not alone. The phone rang at 4:30 in the afternoon, and I almost didn't pick it up because I already knew what kind of day it was. 3 years to the day since I'd buried Carol, my wife of 38 years, the woman who'd waited tables at a diner on Route 9 while I drove a forklift at the lumber yard. The two of us saving every spare dollar until we had enough to open Hensley Hardware in a strip mall outside of Lansing, Michigan. Every year since she'd passed, my daughter Brianne had met me at the cemetery at 5 o'clock sharp. We'd stand by the headstone, say a few words, and then go get pie at the diner where Carol used to work, the one I still owned the building for and refused to ever sell. It was the one tradition Brianne and I had left, the 1 hour a year where she was just my daughter and not the chief operating officer of Hensley Holdings, the company I'd handed to her 3 years earlier when my knees started giving out and I figured it was time to step back. I dialed her cell. It picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear noise behind her, clattering plates, a low hum of conversation, the kind of background you get in a busy kitchen, not an office. "Dad, hey," she said, and her voice had that breathless quality people get when they're trying to sound calm while juggling something. "Listen, I am so sorry. I cannot make it to the cemetery today. We've got a health inspector showing up unannounced at the restaurant and I have to be here to handle it." It's a whole thing. I sat there in my study, in the leather chair Carol had bought me for our 20th anniversary, and I felt that particular hollow feeling settle into my chest, the one that only shows up when somebody you love disappoints you in a way you weren't braced for. But I'd spent 4 decades training myself not to react in the moment. You learn that running a business, you learn to sit with bad news for a second before you respond to it. "It's all right, sweetheart," I told her. "Inspections matter. Go take care of it. I'll go see your mother on my own." "You're the best, Dad. I'll call you tonight. I promise. Love you." The line went dead before I could say it back. I want you to understand something about me before I go any further. I am not a man who cries easily. I didn't cry the day the bank rejected my 4th loan application in 1981. The year I was sleeping in the back office of that first garage because I couldn't afford both rent and payroll. I didn't cry the day Carol told me the chemo wasn't working anymore. I have buried that part of myself so deep that most people who know me would tell you I'm cold, maybe even a little hard. But sitting in that study, phone still warm in my hand, I felt something crack open that I'd kept sealed for years. My own daughter had chosen a restaurant inspection over her mother's grave. And the worst part wasn't even the cemetery. It was that quiet, creeping suspicion I'd been pushing down for months, that something about Brianne's behavior had changed since I'd handed her the keys to the company. I put on my coat anyway and drove out to Riverside Memorial by myself. I stood at Carol's headstone in the cold March wind and told her, the way I always do, that the stores were still standing, that I missed her every single day, and that our girl was building something good with what we'd left her. I almost believed it when I said it. On the drive home, I passed by Marchetti's, the upscale Italian place Brianne's husband Tony had opened 18 months earlier. I'd put up $90,000 of my own money for that restaurant, quietly, without telling the board, because Tony had come to me with tears in his eyes, saying it was his one shot at proving himself, that he wanted to provide for Brianne the way a husband should. I'd never asked for it back. I'd never even mentioned it to anyone outside of my lawyer. I slowed the car as I passed the front window, mostly out of habit, the way you check on something you've invested in. And there she was, my daughter, the one who couldn't leave the restaurant for a health inspection, sitting in the corner booth with a glass of champagne in her hand, laughing with her head thrown back. Across from her sat Tony, looking relaxed and pleased with himself, and beside him sat his mother, Donna, a woman who had never once in 18 months thanked me for the money that built the walls around her. There was no health inspector. There were 3 empty champagne bottles on ice and a server clearing away plates of osso buco. I parked across the street and sat in my car for almost 20 minutes, just watching through the glass. I am not a man who acts on impulse, and I wasn't about to start that night. I watched my daughter laugh at something Tony said, watched Donna reach over and pat her hand like they were sharing some private joke, watched the whole table toast to something I couldn't hear. I rolled the window down a crack, and over the sound of traffic I caught fragments. Donna's voice, sharp and pleased with itself, saying something about, once the paperwork clears. Tony laughing, saying his father-in-law would never see it coming. And then my daughter, my own daughter, raising her glass and saying, loud enough that I heard every word through that cracked window, to Dad finally getting the rest he deserves. I didn't go in. I drove home in silence, the radio off, my hands steady on the wheel even though my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I am a man who has negotiated million-dollar property deals without blinking, and I could not, for the life of me, figure out what the rest he deserves was supposed to mean. But I knew it wasn't a compliment. I knew it the way you know a storm is coming before the sky even changes color, some old animal instinct that's kept me alive in business for 40 years. That night I sat alone in my study with a glass of bourbon I never touched, staring at the framed photo of Carol on my desk, the one from the day we signed the lease on the very first store. I thought about every quarterly report Brienne had walked me through over the last year, all those late nights she said she'd spent modernizing our systems. I thought about the new accountant she'd hired 6 months ago, a woman I'd never met, who Brienne said worked remotely out of Ohio. I thought about how, 3 months back, Brienne had gently suggested I see just a specialist, Dad, for your memory. Nothing serious. After I'd misplaced my reading glasses twice in 1 week, the way any 68-year-old man might. I'd laughed it off at the time. I wasn't laughing now. I picked up the phone and called the one man I trusted more than my own blood, my attorney of 30 years, a sharp old bulldog named Arthur Greaves who'd helped me fight off 3 hostile buyout attempts back in the 90s. It was nearly 9 at night, and he answered on the second ring like he always did when he knew something was wrong. "Walter," he said. "What happened?" I told him everything. The phone call, the cemetery, the restaurant window, the toast. He went quiet on the other end for a long moment. And when Arthur Greaves goes quiet, you know it's bad. "I want a complete forensic review," I told him. "Every account, every signature, every wire transfer that's gone through Hensley Holdings in the last 18 months. I want it done outside the building, outside our normal accounting team, and I want Brienne to know absolutely nothing about it." "You think she's stealing from you?" Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "I think it's worse than that," I said. "I just don't know how yet." He told me to give him 48 hours. I told him to make it 24. I hung up the phone, poured the bourbon down the kitchen sink, because I needed my head clear, not numb, and I sat up the rest of that night in the dark, running through every interaction with my daughter over the past year, like I was auditing my own life. Brienne came by the house the next morning, the way she always did when she felt guilty about something, carrying a paper bag of bagels from the place Carol used to love. She let herself in with her key, calling out my name in that bright, practiced voice she'd perfected for board meetings. "Dad, I brought breakfast." I feel terrible about yesterday. I was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in, and I made myself smile the way I'd smiled at hostile negotiators for 40 years, the smile that gives away absolutely nothing. "Morning, sweetheart," I said. "No need to feel bad. Business is business." She sat down across from me and launched into her excuse before I'd even asked for one. The inspector had shown up out of nowhere, she said. Some surprise visit related to a competitor's complaint. And Tony had panicked and needed her there to handle the paperwork because the manager was out sick. She said she felt awful about missing the cemetery, that she'd light a candle for her mother that night, that she'd make it up to me somehow. It was, I have to tell you, a masterclass in performance. If I hadn't sat in that car across from Marchetti's the night before, watching her raise a champagne glass and toast to my downfall, I might have believed every single word. "I understand," I told her, reaching across the table and patting her hand. The same gesture I'd watched Donna give her the night before. Family comes first, but the business needs tending too. You're carrying a lot, sweetheart. I'm proud of how you've grown into this role. The relief that washed over her face was almost insulting in how easily it came. She thought she'd gotten away with it. She had no idea that 48 hours from that moment, Arthur Greaves would be standing in my study with enough paperwork to bury her. Thanks, Dad, she said, squeezing my hand. I don't know what I'd do without you trusting me like this. I smiled at her again. I trust you completely, I said, and God help me. Every word of it was a lie, and it tasted like ash in my mouth. She left 20 minutes later, and I sat alone with the bagels going stale on the counter, and I let myself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what was happening. The little girl who used to ride on my shoulders at the lumber yard, who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of my truck on the drive home from the store, who had cried harder than anyone at her mother's funeral, was now sitting across from me lying straight to my face about a man who'd given her everything. I let myself grieve that girl for exactly 10 minutes. Then I stood up, washed the coffee cups, and went back to waiting for Arthur's call, because grief was a luxury I could not afford until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. Arthur showed up at my house 2 evenings later instead of calling, which told me everything before he opened his mouth. He set a thick accordion folder on my kitchen table, and his face had the look of a man who'd seen something he wished he hadn't. Walter, he said, sitting down heavily. It's worse than embezzlement. He walked me through it slowly, the way you'd walk a man through a diagnosis. Over the past year, Brianne, with Tony's help, had been quietly siphoning funds from 3 of my 7 stores through a shell vendor account registered in Ohio, the same state where her remote accountant supposedly lived. The account didn't belong to any accountant. It belonged to Donna. Nearly $240,000 had moved through that account in invoices for consulting services that never happened, money that had funded, among other things, the down payment on a lake house Tony and Brianne had quietly purchased and put in Donna's name to keep it off the company books. That alone would have been enough to break my heart. But Arthur wasn't finished, and his hands were shaking slightly as he opened a second folder. There's a doctor, he said, a Dr. Philip Reyes. He runs a small private practice out near Saginaw. We found correspondence going back 4 months between his office and an email address registered to Tony. He slid a printed email chain across the table. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding what was in front of me. Tony had reached out to Dr. Reyes, a man with a documented history of financial trouble and a state medical board complaint already pending against him, and had offered him $15,000 in cash to produce a falsified neurological evaluation. The fabricated report claimed I had been a patient of his for the past 8 months, that I'd undergone cognitive testing showing the early stages of vascular dementia, that I exhibited memory lapses, confusion, and impaired judgment severe enough to require a court-appointed conservator to manage my financial affairs. I had never met this man in my life. I had never set foot in his office. And there, attached to the final email in the chain, dated 4 days earlier, was a scanned medical document with my name, my date of birth, and a fraudulent doctor's seal certifying that I was no longer fit to run the company I'd built from a rented garage with my own bare hands. The toast in the restaurant made horrible, perfect sense now. They weren't celebrating a deal closing. They were celebrating the final piece of paperwork that would let them walk into a courtroom and have a judge strip me of control over Hensley Holdings, all of it, while I sat at home thinking my daughter was simply busy with work. There's a filing date, Arthur said quietly. They're petitioning for conservatorship in 11 days. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time without saying a word. Arthur didn't rush me. He'd known me long enough to understand that I needed the silence to do what I always did with bad news, which was let it settle into something I could actually use. They want to bury me alive, I finally said, while I'm still breathing. Walter, we can go to the police tonight, Arthur said. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, attempted financial exploitation of an elder, the embezzlement on top of it. We have more than enough to have all 3 of them arrested by morning. I thought about it. God knows I wanted to, but I had spent 40 years learning that the loudest reaction is rarely the smartest one, and I was not about to let 4 months of careful planning on their part be answered with a single rushed phone call on mine. No, I said, not yet. They spent months building this. I want them standing in the very room where they meant to bury me when it all collapses on top of them. I want my daughter to understand exactly what she traded me for. So I did something that, looking back, might be the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I let them believe it was working. Over the next 11 days, I played the role they had written for me. I forgot a lunch meeting on purpose and apologized profusely. I asked Brienne to repeat simple instructions twice, watching her eyes light up with something that looked almost like hope, the specific, awful hope of a daughter who wants her father to be exactly as broken as she's claimed he is. I let Tony help me set up a new email password, knowing full well he was documenting every fumbling keystroke for his lawyer. I sat in board meetings and let my mind seem to wander, watching Brienne exchange quick, satisfied glances with the company's general counsel, a man named Russell Kim, who I would later learn had been quietly retained by Tony to file the conservatorship petition the moment the medical report was finalized. Every night, I drove to Arthur's office instead of going straight home, and we built our case in the dark, piece by piece. We tracked down a former employee of Dr. Reyes, who confirmed under sworn statement that no patient file existed for me anywhere in that practice. We subpoenaed the bank records on the Ohio Shell account before Brienne could think to close it. We found text messages between Donna and Tony, recovered through a forensic data specialist Arthur brought in which Donna referred to me as the old fool, and joked about which one of Carol's old rings she was going to ask Brienne for once the estate settles. I read that text message standing in Arthur's office at 11 o'clock at night, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I let myself cry, right there in his leather chair, not because I was broken, but because some part of me had still been hoping, against all the evidence, that I'd somehow misunderstood. I didn't stay broken for long. By the time the morning came, I was back to being the man who built 7 stores out of nothing. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled in a county courtroom on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Arthur first showed me that folder. Brienne, Tony, Donna, and Russell Kim arrived together, the 4 of them walking in with the easy confidence of people who believed the outcome had already been decided. Brienne wouldn't quite meet my eyes when she sat down across the aisle from me, but Donna gave me a small, sympathetic smile, the kind you give a man you believe no longer understands what's happening around him. I almost admired the performance, the way you might admire a forged painting right before you point out the brush strokes are wrong. Arthur stood when the judge called the case, and instead of the petition Tony's lawyer expected to glide through unopposed, Arthur requested permission to enter what he called newly discovered evidence directly relevant to the petitioner's credibility. I watched my daughter's face change in real time as Arthur laid it out. The sworn statement from Dr. Reyes's former employee confirming no medical relationship had ever existed. The bank records tracing $240,000 from Hensley Holdings into the lake house Donna's name was on. The text messages, including the one calling me the old fool, read aloud into the official court record in Arthur's flat, unhurried lawyer's voice. The judge's expression hardened with every page. Tony tried to interrupt twice and was warned by the bailiff. Russell Kim, the lawyer who'd helped file the petition, looked like a man calculating exactly how much trouble he was personally in, and Donna, who had walked in with that pitying little smile on her face, sat frozen, her hand gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. But it was Brienne I watched the entire time. My daughter, who had once fallen asleep against my shoulder on long drives home from the lumberyard, sat very still as the judge read the text message aloud, the one where she herself had written, in response to Donna's joke about Carol's rings, a single line that Arthur read into the record without flinching. "He'll never even know what happened to him." She finally looked at me then, and I let her see, for the first time in 11 days, that I had known everything from the very beginning. I watched her understand, in that moment, exactly what she'd traded for a lake house and a faster path to my company. I felt something in my chest that I won't pretend wasn't grief, real and complete, but underneath it was something steadier, something that had carried me through 40 years of harder mornings than this one. The judge did not grant the conservatorship. He referred the entire matter to the district attorney's office that same afternoon. Within 3 weeks, Tony and Donna were indicted on charges of fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of an elder. Dr. Reyes lost his medical license and is currently facing his own criminal charges. Brienne, because her name appeared directly on the petition, and in correspondence Arthur uncovered showing she'd reviewed and approved the falsified medical report before it was filed, was charged alongside them, though her lawyer is reportedly negotiating a plea. I sold Marchetti's the following month, the building it sat in anyway, since I still legally owned it. I used the proceeds to start something I'd been quietly considering for years, a small business grant fund through the Hensley Foundation, specifically for young people in our county trying to open their first store the way Carol and I once did, with nothing but a rented garage and more determination than sense. I removed Brienne entirely from the company. It was the hardest signature I've ever put on a piece of paper, harder than the one on Carol's hospital paperwork, and I won't pretend otherwise to you tonight. I restructured Hensley Holdings around 3 of my longest-serving store managers, people who had stood beside me through 3 recessions and never once asked me for anything I hadn't already offered. I visit Carol's grave alone now, every year on that same March afternoon, and I've made my peace with going alone, because at least now I know exactly who I'm grieving for, and it isn't just her anymore. I'll tell you the only thing I know for certain after 68 years on this earth. You can hand your children everything you have, every dollar, every brick, every late night you spent, so they'd never know what hunger felt like, and it still doesn't guarantee they'll hand you back even an ounce of loyalty when it matters most. Love your family with everything you've got, but never, ever hand them the keys to your own undoing simply because they share your blood. Protect what you built. Protect your peace. And if the people closest to you are quietly digging a grave for the life you worked so hard to earn, you have every right, neighbor, to make sure they're the ones who end up standing in it. If this story reminded you that the truth always finds its way to the surface, hit that like button and tell me down in the comments what you would have done differently in my shoes. Truth has a strange way of surfacing, even when buried under months of careful lies, and that's the quiet comfort in all this. You don't have to shout or rush to prove what's right. Patience and clear eyes will get you there. Cherish the people who stay honest with you. Hold your peace close, and trust that love built on truth always outlasts. Love built on convenience. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle lesson stays with you a little while.